Fascinating. Well, let's just take a quick segue there, just because you brought it up. Let's talk about evolution for a minute, because, you know, for those of us who haven't been trained as scientists, or what have you, why shouldn't we embrace the quote theory of evolution? I mean, there are a lot of other scientific theories or laws or what have you. I'm not a scientist. I don't know what the correct lingo is, but there are a lot of other theories that we as Christians embrace, the theory of relativity or what have you. What is it about the theory of evolution that's so flawed or wrong that we as Christians, other than the fact that it conflicts with our faith, that we as Christians can't look to it as actual evidence?
So there's a few different things that someone might mean when they're talking about evolution, and that's where some of the confusion arises.
Okay.
So there's some evolution that I would say is not a theory, it's an observation. And that is mutations develop in genomes, and you develop this variation among species, and the species that have attributes that are more profitable for survival, that make it more easy for them to reproduce and pass on and have offspring. Those are the ones that tend to survive.
Is this the natural selection?
Yeah, natural
piece?
selection.
Okay.
The natural selection piece.
Okay.
Right. That's not necessarily theory as much as an observation. Like in my master's research that I did at UCLA, I used directed evolution experiments to evolve bacteria, basically, produce increased levels of methionine.
So that piece is true.
Yeah, that we can observe it. It's not a theory. You can actually observe mutations developing, and I created this selective pressure where the bacteria that were produced more methionine, which is an amino acid, would grow faster, and I was able to select for those particular strains of bacteria.
Got it. Okay.
And so you can see that, and you can see it more in species that reproduce more rapidly. So like insects and bacteria that reproduce new generations very quickly. You can see this effect more than in other species.
Okay.
So the problem is that's a fundamentally different claim than the claim that we all life arose from a single cell organism that existed 1 billion years ago or something like that.
Okay.
So the idea that it's possible for first of all, for a single cell organism to arise into existence out of nothing, without any prior anything living before that, for something to actually come into existence at all is
is that what they claim?
Yeah,
is that the
There's
theory in a nutshell? I mean,
that out of nowhere, a single cell organism came into existence and then started self-replicating and developing mutations, and then from that all life emerged, is basically the concept.
I see.
And so every species that we have some common ancestor that goes back over the course of 1 billion years or so. So humans and all primates, humans, monkeys, gorillas, we had some common ancestor that existed. And then humans and elephants, we had some common ancestor that existed before that. And you have new species that develop. The problem is there's limitations on how much variation you can actually generate through this process. Evolutionary biologists will just take it for granted that you have unlimited ability to generate mutations and changes such that you can develop entire new species. The problem is once you change so much, you're no longer able to reproduce with the old species. You're no longer, like, for instance, you try
Can you give an example on this?
Like, for instance, a horse and a donkey.
Okay.
You mate them together, you get a mule, right?
Okay.
A mule cannot reproduce.
Okay.
So you have two different species that while they can mate together, their offspring is not fertile. Their offspring can't reproduce.
Right.
And so evolution tends to run into problems where they just assume you can do anything. It's like this black box that anything can come out. But we can see that in real life there are limitations. Like you can only change something so much before it no longer can reproduce. Basically genetic diseases that we think of today.
Right.
Right. If you have a mutation, it tends to make things work worse, not better. And so this idea that you could just generate mutations endlessly to create new species, there are limitations that I think evolutionary biology
doesn't account for.
Yeah, that they don't like to acknowledge. I think it's also important that there's no good model for where this original bacteria or where this original single cell organism came from.
Oh, really?
I've seen all kinds of models all over the place of, and the reason that there's so many different models for how life originated is all of them have fundamental flaws. Like they all have some problem. Like I remember looking at one model that someone was proposing that required that the sun replace the Earth's atmosphere 3 times over with a solar flare. Like a solar flare comes and completely changes the Earth's atmosphere to allow for the next stage in development such that life could emerge. So you have to have
crazy assumptions.
Crazy assumptions and things that are so drastic that they're really incompatible with logical thinking when it really boils down to it. I mean, actually, the first lab that I was working in when I was doing my PhD, the professor would outright say that the idea that you can generate even one new protein through random mutation. You put a bacteria out on the beach, expose it to UV light, and let it randomly accumulate mutations. It's absurd to think that you can generate. You could wait 1 billion years. You're not going to get a single new protein. Right? So he wasn't religious. He wasn't a Christian. He had no theological axe to grind. He was just, as a scientist, being honest. He's like, there's no way that this can happen.
So just playing devil's advocate, I mean, has this rebuttal to evolution been addressed in the literature or by the scientific community? Like how?
No, because I think it's a...
Is it an echo chamber? Like
I think it's an echo chamber.
Let's be fair. I mean, have they considered this?
I don't think so. I think because now religious thought and scientific thought have diverted so drastically that evolution has just become the paradigm among scientists.
It's just accepted.
It's just accepted and taken for granted. And you're really not allowed to criticize it. You're not allowed to say, there are still problems that we haven't addressed.
Wow.
Because they're so taken by this idea that life had to emerge through natural means.
Wow. I mean, do you know that when this theory was originally, developed or conceived, if there was a pushback? Were there journals written by the scientific community on the other side?
Even Darwin admitted that if you could find a species that couldn't have possibly emerged through a series of small, simple steps, then his whole theory would break down. And his problem was at the time they didn't understand molecular biology. They didn't understand proteins, DNA, things at the molecular level. And I think if he had understood that, he wouldn't have given his theory the credibility that he had given it. Because he was thinking about small changes like the size of a bird's beak.
Microevolution, right? Is that what we call microevolution versus macro?
Natural selection. The idea that you have birds with different size beaks or giraffes with different lengths of their necks.
That's logical. I mean,
he wasn't imagining this molecular world where there's proteins in DNA and you have to have drastic changes in DNA to produce entirely new functions in biology.
So who came up with this? Sorry, I'm obviously uninformed on that. Who came up with the specific theory of evolution as it applies to this, original...
It would have been Darwin. Darwin came up with the idea that new species could arise through this process of natural selection.
And then scientists later, in other words, hooked onto it to create this extrapolation. With
or specifically
specifically
atheists jumped on board with this. And then at some point it became unchristian to work in the scientific field, and it became unscientific to be in the Christian. And so these domains started to separate.
I see. So is that a thing now in the scientific community that Christians are kind of, you kind of keep it in the closet?
Not as much as people want to think. Like, I think in biology you're less likely to find Christians, but in the realm of physics you're more likely.
Talk about that. Why is that?
Because I think, particularly when physicists realize you can't have a universe that comes out of nothing. I think one of the questions that we got was,
why not?
Yeah, did God use science to create the world or the universe?
Oh,
right?
yeah, that was a good question.
And it's a good question, but I think the question is actually fundamentally, could the universe or could the world have arisen through natural means? Okay. And I think physicists realized you can't, because you can't have something that comes out of nothing. Because all physicists realize that the universe has a finite lifespan, and that's because of the laws of thermodynamics.
Okay, and that's over my pay grade.
Well, not as much as you think. Like, these are the laws. Yeah, these are the laws that go into how a refrigerator works.
Okay.
So these are fundamental scientific laws of thermodynamics that processes progress towards more disorder, not more order.
Okay.
So the universe is
Oh,
slowly
yeah.
progressing
Okay.
into more disorder,
Okay.
and thus has a finite lifespan. Eventually the universe is going to decay into what we call the heat death, where nothing can happen anymore because everything is
That
all.
sounds scary, guys.
Well, yeah, they
Let's
call
hope
it
we're not close.
the heat death of the universe. No, it's something that would
Just
be
joking.
trillions of years away. But it, at the end of the
Okay.
day, the universe has a finite lifespan and it had a beginning. And
Okay.
physicists know that you can't have a beginning of the universe without breaking our current laws of physics. You have to have some supernatural event
This is key. This is key.
yeah, that our current laws of physics can't account for.
Can you just explain that one more time? Because
I think the best
I think this is
explanation of
critical.
it goes to actually a quote from Isaac Newton.
Okay.
When he developed his theory of gravity that defined the motions of the planets. One of his things that he wanted to emphasize when he published his stuff is, yes, these mathematical models determine how the universe works, how the planets move, but someone still had to set the planets in motion. And that's something that physicists understand, that someone had to set this stuff in motion. That idea still applies today. And without some supernatural event setting these things in motion, nothing would be happening. And that's something biologists don't think about. They think about things once life is already created, this is what's going on.
Well, they don't ever address the question of, well, I guess they have evolution to address how life started.
Yeah, but they don't ever really address how life started. They kind of leave it as some black box of, well, life had to have started because we exist.